The Sleeping Beauty story you know is a lie, not a misunderstanding, not a simplification for young children. A deliberate fabrication, built with surgical precision over 6 centuries to conceal one of the most disturbing tales European literature has ever produced. You were told a prince woke her with a kiss, that it's a story of true love, that the curse had a solution and the ending was happy. In the original versions, there was no kiss, there was no romance, there was no choice. There was a rape, documented in explicit detail. There was a pregnancy and a birth the protagonist had no memory of experiencing. There was a second half of the story, so dark, so impossible to soften, that every rewriter in every century made the same decision: cut it and bury it before anyone could read it. And here's the part you won't be able to forget. Once you understand what Venus ordered the knight to do in the 1340 text, once you read the exact words Giambattista Basile used in 1634 to describe what the king did to the sleeping princess, and once you grasp why the Brothers Grimm amputated the entire second half of the tale to build a nation, you will never be able to look at that image of the prince leaning over the bed without knowing what it replaced. Because the kiss wasn't an ending, it was a cover-up. Let's begin. The story begins between 1330 and 1344 in some French monastery or court whose author's name we don't even know. The text is called Perceforest. It's an anonymous courtly romance, the kind that circulated through the noble salons of medieval France. And in that text appears, for the first time in European literature, a princess who falls into a sleep she cannot wake from alone. Her name is Zellandine. And before we go any further, you need to understand something about the world this text was written in. Imagine a hall with tapestries hanging on stone walls, enormous cloths depicting battles between virtues and vices, allegorical figures walking among mortals as if they were flesh and blood. Because in medieval literature, they were. Reason was a woman in a white tunic who could grab you by the arm and drag you off the wrong path. Discretion was a stern matron who could block your doorway, and Venus, the goddess of desire, was a radiant and terrible figure who didn't suggest, she commanded. It's in that hall that the knight Troilus finds Zellandine asleep, unconscious in her tower, enchanted by a spell no one has managed to break. And it's at that exact threshold where something happens that 14th century readers would have understood without any explanation. 2 figures materialize in front of him, reason and discretion in person. They block his path. They tell him explicitly, not as a metaphor, but as a direct warning from the forces of moral order, that what he is contemplating is wrong, that violating an unconscious woman without her consent makes a man the worst kind of criminal. And then Venus appears, radiant, terrible. The text doesn't say she tempts Troilus, it says she commands him. And within the moral framework of the medieval courtly romance, when a deity gives a direct order, mortals obey. The text describes what happens next without ambiguity. Troilus rapes Zellandine while she sleeps. The princess does not wake from the rape. Her body will carry and give birth to a child over the following 9 months without her ever regaining consciousness. She gives birth in her sleep. And it's only when her baby, desperately searching for milk, sucks on his mother's finger instead of her breast, and in doing so accidentally pulls out the linen splinter keeping her asleep, that Zellandine opens her eyes to find herself a mother with no memory of becoming pregnant, no memory of giving birth, no idea who left her that way. The medieval text, according to scholar Patricia Terry of the University of California, who studied the Perceforest in the 1980s, records that Zellandine mourns the non-consensual act she suffered, even as she is expected to love the man who committed it. That is the original text. That is what 6 centuries of rewrites replaced with a kiss. 300 years later, in 1634, a man named Giambattista Basile did something no one had attempted before. He wrote the same story, without metaphors, without allegorical figures, without the excuse of Venus as divine command. Basile was a courtier, soldier, and administrator who had traveled across Italy collecting the darkest, most grotesque, most impossible to tell out loud stories. His book, the Pentamerone, was written in Neapolitan dialect, specifically for aristocrats competing with one another to prove that nothing could shock them. Imagine the salon halls of 17th century Naples. 40 candle chandeliers, the smell of hot wax and roasted peacock, the nobles in their powdered wigs and embroidered suits, listening as a reader reads aloud stories that blend horror with the most exquisite Baroque ornament. They laugh when they're supposed to. They go silent when they're supposed to. Because they, who attended public executions as entertainment and kept court dwarfs for their amusement, could process anything, as long as it was wrapped in sufficiently elaborate language. Basile knew exactly what his audience wanted. His version is called Sun, Moon, and Talia, and in it, the text hides behind no Venus. A great lord consults astrologers about his daughter Talia's future. The astrologers warn him, a linen splinter will endanger her life. The lord bans all linen from his kingdom, but prophecies have a particular way of fulfilling themselves. Talia grows up, finds an old woman spinning, becomes fascinated by the spinning wheel, pricks her finger, and collapses into something that looks like death. Her devastated father abandons the entire palace with her body inside. Years later, a king out on a hunting expedition gets lost in the woods. He discovers the abandoned castle. He climbs to the tower. He finds Talia, perfectly preserved, unconscious, with no sign of life except for her chest rising and falling. The Basile's text makes no excuses. It invokes no gods. What it describes next is in 17th century Italian, but scholar Nancy Canepa of Dartmouth College, who has studied the Pentamerone for decades, notes that the correct translation of the original words is this: the king, aroused by her beauty, rapes her. Then he leaves, as if nothing had happened, as if he'd hunted a deer and returned to his quarters. Talia remains unconscious through the pregnancy, through the 9 months of gestation, through childbirth. She has twins, a girl and a boy, whom people call Sun and Moon, without knowing she conceived them. The babies survive beside her while she sleeps, until one day, one of the twins goes looking for its mother's breast to feed, can't find it, grabs her finger instead, and by sucking on it, pulls out the linen splinter. Talia wakes up to find herself the mother of 2 children whose existence she cannot explain. Basile doesn't stop there, and what comes next is where the story reaches its darkest point. The king returns. He finds her awake. He is, according to the text, delighted by what he has achieved. Not ashamed, not sorry, delighted. But the king has a wife, and his wife discovers the truth. The queen sends for Talia and the twins, and what she orders next connects this story to one of the most recurring patterns in European folklore: revenge through cannibalism. The queen orders the palace cook to kill the twins and prepare them as a dish for the king's dinner. Her logic is chillingly calculated. She wants the king to consume his own children without knowing he's doing it. She wants the last thing he took without permission, Talia's life, transformed into those 2 children, returned to him in the most repulsive way imaginable. This motif of the cannibal feast, where a betrayal victim makes the aggressor unknowingly devour their own loved ones, wasn't Basile's invention. It ran through European literature and mythology since antiquity as a collective cry, as the crime that most perfectly symbolized the absolute corruption of the natural order. In Greek mythology, Procne discovered that her husband Tereus had raped her sister Philomela and cut out her tongue to silence her. In revenge, Procne killed her own son Itus, cooked him, and served him to Tereus at a banquet. Only after Tereus had finished eating did Procne reveal what he had just consumed. In the cycle of the Atriids, Thyestes was invited by his brother Atreus to a banquet of reconciliation. What he ate that night was his own children. From ancient Greece to medieval Europe,
These stories of cannibal feasts appear over and over again, always in the same context, as a representation of the most extreme violation of the bond between parents and children, the point at which humanity becomes monster. Basile knew exactly what he was evoking. The story's cook, however, cannot bring himself to kill the babies. He hides them with his wife. He serves the king lamb instead. And while the king eats what he believes are his own children, the queen whispers, "Eat, eat, you're eating what is yours." The phrase becomes a mantra, a curse, the celebration of a revenge she believes completed. When the king discovers the truth, that Talia and the twins are alive, that the cook saved them, the queen attempts a second revenge. She prepares a copper vat filled with vipers, toads, and venomous snakes. She wants to throw Talia, the children, and the cook himself inside. The king arrives just in time, and the queen, in her fury, falls into her own vat.
That is Basile's ending. It's not a happy ending. It's an ending of balanced horror. The rape went unpunished, but the revenge did not triumph either. Everyone who participated in that chain of destruction ended up consumed by it. In 1697, Charles Perrault took the same material and brought it to the court of Louis XIV. To understand what Perrault did and why he did it, you need to see the world he moved in. Versailles, 1697. Every corridor gleams with gold leaf. Every conversation can determine your future or destroy it. And in that atmosphere of constant calculation, something new is happening. Women are beginning to claim a voice. The literary salons of Paris, led by women like Madame de Sévigné and Madame de Lafayette, are spaces where philosophy, literature, and politics are debated with a freedom that terrifies the conservative men of the era. The précieuses, intellectual women who frequent these salons, openly question marriage, discuss alternatives to motherhood, and claim the right to choose their own lovers. Perrault wasn't just a storyteller. He was a cultural warrior in that battle for the soul of France. A member of the Académie Française and a defender of modern literature over the Greco-Latin classics, Perrault understood that fairy tales weren't entertainment. They were tools for social conditioning, instruments for shaping minds before dangerous ideas could take root. So he made a calculated decision. He eliminated the rape. He replaced it with the prince kneeling before the princess. No contact. But here's what's revealing. Perrault kept the cannibal's second half. He even embellishes it. In his version, the prince secretly marries the awakened princess because his mother is literally an ogress with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. When the prince goes off to war, his mother orders the cook to prepare the young queen and her grandchildren for dinner. The cook substitutes animals for them. When the ogress discovers the deception, she prepares a vat filled with reptiles and venomous creatures. The prince returns in time. The ogress, in her rage, falls into her own trap. Perrault kept the monsters and the banquets. He removed the rape. Historian Jack Zipes of the University of Minnesota, who has spent decades studying fairy tales as political technology, notes that this move by Perrault was a direct response to the rise of the intellectual women of his era. The princess who sleeps and waits, passive, beautiful, without agency, was the model society needed to preserve. The woman who acts, who chooses, who is awake, was the threat. The beauty who stays silent, perfectly asleep, eternally available to be found. That was the ideal. The woman who was awake was the danger. A century later, in 1812, the Brothers Grimm completed the amputation that Perrault had begun. But Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm weren't collecting stories out of love for folklore. They were building a nation. Germany didn't exist in 1812. Only a mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and free cities with different laws, different customs, sometimes different languages. The Grimms believed that buried in the folklore of peasant women and grandmothers lay the pure German spirit, uncontaminated by French influence or corrupting modernity. Their collection of tales, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, household and children's stories,
was meant to be the cornerstone of a national identity. But that nationalist project required purity. The Grimms were devout Protestants, shaped by the strict moral code of their time. They could not present rape and cannibalism as part of the German soul. Across 7 editions, they systematically cleaned their stories, removed obscene content, softened violence, added Christian morality where none had existed before. For Sleeping Beauty, called Rosora in their version, they didn't just clean it. They amputated the story in half. Their version ends exactly where modern audiences expect it to: the kiss, the awakening, the wedding. Everything that follows, the secret marriage, the ogress mother-in-law, the attempted infanticide, the vat of snakes, disappears. Cut, buried, as if it had never existed. The result was a story with no internal logic whatsoever. In the Perceforest and in Basile, the princess didn't wake up with a kiss because the kiss was never the waking mechanism. She woke up because the baby born from the rape accidentally pulled the splinter from her finger. The children were, literally, the agent that broke the curse. They had to exist in the story because they were the story. When the Grimms eliminated the rape and the pregnancy, and Perrault had preceded them by substituting it with the kiss, they had to invent a new spell-breaking mechanism. Something that didn't carry the implications of the original.
The kiss is not a romantic ending added by storytellers with good taste. It's a patch over a narrative hole blown open by censorship. It's the scar of something someone decided you shouldn't see. The original versions of Sleeping Beauty were not love stories. They were records of something that medieval and Renaissance adults understood with a clarity we have lost. That the body of a sleeping woman, unconscious, unresponsive, generated no legal or moral protection in most of Europe for centuries. That sexual violence against women in states of vulnerability was so commonplace, it could appear as the plot of an aristocratic entertainment story, without anyone in the room objecting. Basile didn't write a horror story because he wanted to disturb his readers. He wrote it because that was the world he knew, and every rewriter who came after, Perrault with his political calculation, the Grimms with their national project, Disney with their marketing machine, made the same decision. The story was too useful, too recognizable, too powerful to abandon. But the truth it contained was too uncomfortable to preserve. So they built the kiss, a clean, romantic gesture with no history. A moment that can be printed on a 4-year-old girl's t-shirt, projected on a movie screen, sung as a lullaby. A gesture designed so you never ask what came before it. What came before the kiss is sun, moon, and Talia waking up in a room with 2 children she doesn't remember conceiving. It's Zellandine grieving in silence, in a text 700 years old, over the act done to her. What came before the kiss is the question that 6 centuries of rewrites tried to bury. Who gets to decide when the whole story gets told? And the answer, as always, says far more about the ones doing the burying than about the story they're burying. Next time on the Grimm Vault, we open a special series on the world of Game of Thrones with the story that inspired House of the Dragon and the 3 oaths England broke that ignited the real war behind the Dance of the Dragons.